An important businessman went to see his doctor because he could not sleep at night. The doctor examined him carefully and then said to him, "Your trouble is that you need to learn to relax. Have you got any hobbies?" The businessman thought for a few moments and then said, "No, doctor, I haven't. I don't have any time for hobbies." "Well," the doctor answered, "that is your main trouble. You see, you don't have time for anything except your work. You must find some hobbies, and you must learn to relax with them, or you'll be dead in less than 5 years. Why don't you learn to paint pictures?" "All right, doctor," the businessman said. "I'll try that." The next day he telephoned the doctor and said, "That was a very good idea of yours, doctor. Thank you very much. I've already painted 15 pictures since I saw you." Mr. Hodge was a kitchen farmer. He had hundreds of kitchens and sold the eggs and the meat and got quite a lot of money for them. But he lived in a very hot part of the country, and he found that his hens laid hardly any eggs in the summer. So he decided to put air conditioning into his kitchen house so that the hens would lay well all through the year and he could get more eggs and in that way earn more money. Owner of the company which sold the air conditioner came to see him, and when he saw Mr. Hodge's house, he thought that he might be able to persuade him to buy some air conditioner for that too. "Your wife would be much happier and more comfortable then," he said to Mr. Hodge, but Mr. Hodge was not interested. "My wife doesn't lay eggs," he said. Helen lived with her sister Mary. Both of them were about 75 years old, and neither of them had ever married. They had a small old car, and when they wanted to go somewhere, which they did very rarely, Mary always drove because her eyes were better. One weekend, they drove to a large town to look at some things which they had read about in the newspaper. Neither of them had been to that town before. They were driving along in a lot of traffic when they turned right into a street which cars were not allowed to go into. There was a policeman there, and he blew his whistle, but Mary did not stop, so he got onto his motorcycle and followed them. After he had ordered them to stop, he said, "Didn't you hear me blow my whistle?" "Yes, we did," admitted Mary politely, "but Mommy told us never to stop when men whistle at us." Mrs. Scott bought a new house last year. The walls of the rooms had been painted a short time before, and Mrs. Scott liked the colors, but the person who had sold her the house had taken the curtains with him, so Mrs. Scott had to buy new ones, and of course she wanted to buy ones whose colors would go with the walls of her rooms. She discovered that her comb was exactly the same color as these walls. So she always took it with her whenever she went to look for clothes for curtains. In one shop, she showed the shopkeeper the comb and then looked at various clothes for curtains for half an hour with him until he got tired and said to her, "Madam, wouldn't it be easier just to buy some cloth you like and then find a new comb to go with that?" When Dave Perkins was young, he played a lot of games and he was thin and strong. But when he was 45, he began to get fat and slow. He was not able to breathe as well as before. And when he walked rather fast, his heart beat painfully. He did not do anything about this for a long time, but finally he became anxious and went to see a doctor. And the doctor sent him to hospital. Another young doctor examined him there and said, "I don't want to mislead you, Mr. Perkins. You're very ill, and I believe that you are unlikely to live much longer. Would you like me to arrange for anybody to come and see you before you die?" Dave thought for a few seconds, and then he answered, "I'd like another doctor to come and see me." George Banks was a clever journalist. He worked for a good newspaper, and he liked arguing very much. He argued with anybody and about anything. Sometimes the people whom he argued with were as clever as he was, but often they were not. He did not mind arguing with stupid people at all. He knew that he could never persuade them to agree, because they could never really understand what he was saying. And the stupider they were, the surer they were that they were right. But he often found that stupid people said very amusing things. At the end of one argument which George had with one of these less clever people, the man said something which George has always remembered and which has always amused him. It was, "Well, sir, you should never forget this. There are always three answers to every question: your answer, my answer, and the correct answer." Mark went to a barber's shop and had his hair cut, but when he came out, he was not happy with the result. And when his friend George saw him, he laughed and said, "What's happened to your hair, Mark?" Mark said, "I tried a new barber shop today because I wasn't at all satisfied with my old one. But this one seems even worse." George agreed. "Yes, I think you're right, Mark. Now I'll tell you what to do next time you go into a barber shop. Look at all the barbers' hair, and then go to the one whose own hair has been cut the worst." "The one whose hair's been cut the worst?" Mark repeated. "But that would be foolish." "Oh no, it wouldn't," answered George. "Who do you think cut that man's hair? He couldn't cut it himself, could he? Another of the barbers cut it, and he must have been a worse barber than the one whose hair he cut." Later, Judd joined the army when he was 18, and for several months he was taught how to be a good soldier. He did quite well in everything except shooting. One day he and his friends were practicing their shooting, and all of them were doing quite well except Peter. After he had shot at the target 9 times and had not hit it once, the officer who was trying to teach the young soldiers to shoot said, "You're quite hopeless, Peter. don't waste your last bullet to go behind that wall and shoot yourself with it." Peter felt ashamed. He went behind the wall, and a few seconds later, the officer and the young soldiers heard the sound of a shot. "Heavens," the officer said. "Has that silly man really shot himself?" He ran behind the wall anxiously, but Peter was all right. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, "but I missed again." During the Second World War, it was difficult to travel by plane because the seats were needed for important government and army people. Mr. Brown worked for the government during the war. He was a civilian and he was doing very secret work, so nobody was allowed to know how important he was except a very few people. One day, he had to fly to Edinburgh to give a lecture to a few top people there. But an important army officer came to the airport at the last minute, and Mr. Brown's seat was given to him, so he was not able to fly to the city to give his lecture. It was not until he reached the city that the important officer discovered that the man whose seat he had taken was the one whose lecture he had flown to the city to hear.